Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to another exciting session from within the Division for Research Development's information session for 2022. And I hope that this session will also add value in terms of your various research projects, but also outline how this division supports research and how the specific review committee or the ethics committee supports your research projects by reviewing them. So welcome. Whitney, am I audible? Sorry, I didn't even ask.
Yes, you are.
Okay, so our first speaker is Professor Samantha Sampson, but I am not sure if she's in the meeting already. Samantha, are you in the meeting? Okay, so she's not in the meeting and will most probably join within a few minutes. Whitney, is it okay if we could perhaps start at 12:33? We give her another 2 minutes. Oh, there she is. Hi, Sam. Okay, now that...
Hi, Winston. Sorry to give you heart failure.
I almost needed some medical assistance. Nonetheless, welcome, and I'll quickly introduce Professor Sampson to us. She completed her undergrad studies at Stellenbosch University, undergrad and postgraduate studies at Stellenbosch University, did a postdoc at Harvard in the United States, working on TB vaccines. Then she did a fellowship at Imperial College, working on TB-host pathogen interactions. And then finally returned to South Africa in 2013. I can still remember our first meeting when Sam and I met. It was behind my desk somehow. They introduced Sam to me. She came back in 2013 with a SACHI chair, or with a SACHI, and the group continues to work on TB-host pathogen interactions. She has 20 plus years experience in biosafety level 2 and biosafety level 3 laboratories. But she points out that at this very moment, she regards herself as a desk jockey. But also, she is the chair for the Biosafety Committee, and the proper name for the committee is the Research Ethics Committee, Biological and Environmental Safety. And without further ado, Sam, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Winston. And once again, I'm really sorry for being late. I had a double booking and a meeting that I really couldn't shift. So I apologize for that. Thank you for the introduction, Winston, and thank you for very ably steering our Research Ethics Committee for Biosafety. We're very grateful to you. So I'm going to I'm going to go into presenter view, in which case I'm not going to be able to see hands or questions. So Winston, if there are any urgent questions, please just jump in on the mic and shout at me, and I will pause.
Okay, I will alert you. Thank you.
Okay, just need to switch over. Okay, are you seeing the correct version of this?
Affirmed, yes.
Okay, so thanks everyone for your patience, and thanks to the Division for Research Development for organizing this very informative series. So I'm obviously here representing the Research Ethics Committee for Biological and Environmental Safety, or RECBES, as I'll refer to it for convenience. And as such, I'll be talking about the role of the Biosafety Committee and elements that we consider when reviewing applications, and some of the common errors that we commonly observe. So I think I haven't looked at who's in the audience today, but I suspect that for some of you, your work would not require REC-based registration, but I do think it's still worthwhile of having some awareness of how to think about biosafety and why it matters. So some of the things we require for REC-based applications are simply good laboratory practice. And this supports rigor and reproducibility in research, and it enables the effective use of very scarce research money, which I think we all strive for. So for those who deal with biohazards in your day-to-day work, I apologize for going back to basics, but I think it is useful to start off with a few fundamental definitions. So the crux of this committee is obviously biohazards and biosafety. Biohazards then are risks to the health of humans or the environment, which arise from biological work, specifically with microbes, that is bacteria, viruses, and fungi. Biosafety also refers to those practices and equipment that are applied to prevent exposure to potentially infectious agents or biohazards, and it refers to the containment conditions under which these agents can be safely manipulated. And the purpose of all of this is to protect people, animals, and the environment. So a question that often comes up is, why does biosafety fall under the Research Ethics Committee remit? So to address this, I'm falling back to the common definition of doing the right thing even when no one is looking. So Prof Wellstead also alluded to this in his talk in this series last week. So it's doing the right thing even when there are consequences for you. So in a lab, a consequence of adopting a safer working practice might be that something takes twice as long and costs 3 times as much, but it is the right thing to do. So in more academic terms, I think this audience will be very familiar with some of the principles of biomedical ethics, such as autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. And in my own more science-minded view, our REC-BES review process is heavily focused on non-maleficence. So that is the absence or minimizing of harm to our researchers, to the general population, and of course to the environment. So the general philosophy of good biosafety practice is the application of common sense. But I unfortunately have to say that in my 20-odd years of lab experience, common sense is not common. So what we mean by this are practices that include some of the following. So that is reasonable care for your own and other safety, using equipment and reagents in a safe manner, to only perform tasks when you have been adequately trained for that task, cooperating with others to ensure a healthy and safe workplace, and then of course following the policies and procedures of the specific lab that you're working in. So there's a very long history of awareness of the need for good biosafety practices, as well as the lack thereof. So the papers I'm referring to here are not the first or only or most recent of them, but I think they're really useful to make this point. So these researchers published a number of studies a few years back on laboratory-acquired infections, or LAIs. So in these studies, they surveyed over 5,000 labs and identified over 3,900 cases of laboratory-acquired infections. Very concerningly, fewer than 20% of these incidents were linked to known accidents, meaning that either the risks were not recognized at the time or incidents were just not reported. So I'm going to return to this point on reporting in just a moment. But for now, to say, their conclusion was that more than 80% of reported cases were likely due to exposure to infectious aerosols. So as a TB researcher, infectious aerosols are something that we, of course, work very hard to avoid. And of course, the pandemic that we are currently in has brought this into, really highlighted this for the broader population. So these studies have really brought into focus the need for clear guidelines on safe working practices. And this agenda of lab safety was, of course, further promoted by the advent of the HIV/AIDS era, and this prompted extensive legislation and guidelines for working with potentially infectious biological samples. And fortunately, studies have shown that this has had a positive impact by reducing the number of laboratory-acquired infections. However, we cannot afford to let down our guard. And obviously, there are continued risks that are inherently associated with lab work, and good biosafety practices are an ongoing work in progress and should be continually monitored, evaluated, and refined. And this, I think, is part of the function of our committee. So typically, institutions that work with potentially harmful biological materials would have such a committee that is in charge of biosafety. And this committee would be expected to create and monitor biosafety standards that need to be met to prevent accidental release of potentially harmful biological material. So as I've already alluded to, a key function of the committee is to protect our personnel, the public, and the environment. But I think a fourth entity that is often overlooked is that of our product. And by this, I mean our product as a researcher, and that is our results, our data. And here, I think it's important to note that consistent and safe working procedures will help to ensure the quality and reliability of this product. Other considerations are, of course, funder requirements and the law. I don't have time to go into all of these, but it is, of course, an important function of such a committee, that is to ensure that these funder and legal requirements are met. The final point I want to make here is a bit more abstract, and that is that I believe that if operated correctly, this committee can ultimately help to foster a positive culture of biosafety awareness. And I say this because my experience, and this is not just at Stellenbosch, has been that there tends to be this perception that it is a bit uncool to be concerned about biosafety. And there can be a surprising amount of peer pressure and negative attitudes and pushback, often from quite senior and experienced staff on this topic. So this is important because no matter how good your physical containment measures and written rules are, these are always subject to the human factor. So studies have in fact shown that the behavior and attitudes of workers can have a significant impact on the likelihood of them being involved in lab accidents. And I've listed some of the characteristics here of those who are likely to have fewer or more accidents. And based on this, I think the last line shows that I'm potentially a very safe person in the lab. So it's maybe a bit idealistic, but I think that approaching this committee in the right way will offer a unique opportunity to turn attitudes around, to educate and encourage peer pressure to be applied in a more positive way. And I'd like this committee to be experienced as a useful instrument to encourage safe working practices and consequently support good science, rather than just an annoying box-ticking exercise. So I'm not going to go into the specifics of the REC-based mandate. I think Winston is going to cover this in his slide, but just to broadly say that collectively, our members of the committee have a wide depth and breadth of expertise. We have members from Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences, Food Science, Microbiology, and also experts in nanomaterials, genetically modified organisms, and occupational health and safety. Many of our members were currently or were recently actively working in labs, and I think have a very practical and pragmatic approach. So it may not always seem like it, but we do try to educate and facilitate rather than obstruct research. One of the points I wanted to make, I know this slide was shown in the last meeting, but I think it bears repeating. Something that we very frequently encounter is confusion around research that needs to be reviewed by multiple committees. So as a starting point, I would urge people to look at this handy infographic. I think it's important to stress that the research ethics committees review very different aspects of the research. So approval by one committee does not necessarily mean that you are fully compliant, and it really is best to check. We are working towards having better communication and integration between the committees, but talk to your reps and they can advise on how best to start the process for the most efficient review. So I'm going to quickly go over in the next few slides some points that are more relevant to actual applicants, but I think it's worth mentioning for a general audience as well. I'll be light on detail though. So we, over the years, have seen a number of common errors or omissions in applications. And again, my first advice to researchers would be to get input from the committee before you start. Things that are often missing or inadequate include floor plans, risk assessments, SOPs, documentation. So I'll come back to the risk assessments and SOPs, but just to quickly talk about documentation. So this is referring to evidence of training, decontamination procedures, service records, and so on. And really it's worth including these in the application because we will ask for them. In terms of training and evidence of training, this is something that we've encountered in numerous applications, and to address this, recently we developed a series of training videos that are now available on Sunline. So there are 6 of these videos. People can register on Sunlearn, and once they've completed watching the videos, they take a quiz, and then they can show that result from the quiz as part. They can save that result from the quiz and provide that with part of the application. The last point here is leave enough time. As with all things of this nature, it is going to take longer than you think to complete the application. And rush jobs are obvious. They create a poor impression and are likely to require revision, which will delay the entire process. So SOPs, or standard operating procedures. This is something that often trips up applications. And so I just wanted to highlight this as something that people need to consider. So they're obviously needed for specific experiments, that goes without saying, but people often miss including SOPs for transport, for waste management, for spill procedures. So we are working on providing some examples and templates of SOPs, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail now, but just to say, here is an example. It would include features such as a title, so that we know what you're doing. We would want to see the version. So version control is something that people really need to pay attention to. That could be a whole another lecture. Date. These things do have an expiry date. They are not valid in perpetuity. Things change, and so they should be reviewed on a regular basis. We also want to see who developed the SOP, who reviewed it, who approved it. So these are all things to consider. Again, a whole nother lecture, so I won't waste too much time there. Another thing that is really crucial and that we think people need to pay more attention to is risk assessments. So to manage risk, you need a little bit of imagination on the negative side, I guess, because you need to think about what could be the possible routes of exposure, and then you need to identify and measure the risk and implement measures to control, minimize, and where possible to prevent this risk. So I'm not going to go into all the details on the next slide, but briefly, risk assessment needs to consider the worst case scenario. So it would take several factors into account, such as how likely would this be, how serious would this be, and how could it be managed. So once the risk has been identified and evaluated, then appropriate preventative measures should be developed. So a useful tool here is the risk assessment matrix, where we consider the likelihood of risk relative to the severity of consequences. So based on appropriate risk assessments, organisms are classified into 4 levels of risk groups as detailed in this table. So this is not something that the researcher would have to do, but they can look these things up or consult with us. So these range from organisms that are in risk group 1, which pose little or no individual and community risk and are unlikely to cause human disease, all the way to those in risk group 4, where there's a high individual and community risk, serious disease, easy transmission, and no preventative measures or effective treatments. Fortunately, as far as I know, we do not have any risk group 4 work at Stellenbosch. So I'm not going to go into the detail of this table, but what this is showing is an overview of the agents, special practices, and the primary and secondary barriers that are associated with each of the 4 biosafety levels. So again, I'm not going to go into all the detail, but much of what we are reviewing for RecBest falls under biosafety level 2 or biosafety level 3. So to show this a bit more visually, as an example of some of the primary barriers that we would typically see in a biosafety level 3 setting, this researcher is wearing their own powered filtered air respirator, and they're working in a biosafety cabinet that would draw infectious aerosols away from the researcher. Not visible in this picture would be secondary barriers or engineering controls, such as negative pressure in the lab, which would prevent any hazardous organisms from escaping from the lab. In most biosafety level 2 labs would be dressed as pictured here. So we would have protective eyewear, a lab coat, covered legs, covered feet, probably wearing gloves, and any long hair would be tied back. And I called on a friend to just reinforce that message. I think in terms of SOPs, another really important thing that people often leave out is reporting. I think it's really important to have clear guidelines and procedures on what to do if there's an incident or a near miss. And I think with this, it's really critical to convey the message that this is not about policing people in a negative sense. So I just recall your attention to the literature that I mentioned at the beginning, where many lab accidents or infections are not attributed to specific accidents. Now, some accidents would be hard to hide, but it's actually the near misses and what some might consider to be minor incidents that should be viewed as opportunities for improvement. So often these incidents and near misses can reveal inadequacies in procedures or training, and identification of these can help to prevent more serious occurrences in the future. So that's why I think it's really important for people to have clear practices for incident and near miss reporting as part of their protocol development. So I'm not going to talk about how to apply. I know Winston is going to cover that. I will just leave you, and you will get a copy of these slides. I will leave you with a list of a few important resources. So a lot of times we refer to the CDC and WHO biosafety manuals, which I've given links to here. I have mentioned the biosafety training materials that are now available on Sunlearn. And of course, you can link to our website and contact us for further input and information. Before I end off, I think it's really important to say, and sorry, you can read this while I'm talking. I think I have to say a big thank you to Winston, who, as I said, keeps us all on track, to my Vice Chair, Corinna de Beer, who is a very practical and efficient sounding board, and Marlene Fischer, who's now no longer part of the committee, but has been an important part in getting us to the point we're at now. And of course, all of my other committee members who are very efficient reviewers. So that's it from me. I'm going to get out, stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Samantha. It was a very interesting lecture. And I hope we're going to have questions and have robust discussion. So I'm opening up the floor for any questions that you might have to Professor Sampson. You are also welcome to make use of the chat function if you want to type your question to Professor Sampson. If not, we can perhaps move on to the second presentation, and at the end of that presentation, open it all up for a discussion and question. Does that sound okay, Sam? Are you happy with that?
That's perfect, Winston. Thank you.
Okay. Right, so we will now go over to the next presenter, and I know that the next presenter, and I am sure my fellow Reg Best people also know the next presenter, and that's myself. I'm Winston A Beukes, also within the Division for Research Development. So I'm responsible for the administrative function of the Research Ethics Committee, Biological and Environmental Safety. So my presentation will focus more on the applied side in terms of process and how the committee functions. So Sam, I will also not be able to see questions that might pop up. So if you could just keep an eye on that, or even with me, if you could do that, that would be great. So colleagues, I'll dive right into it. There's the committee, there's my name and the title, Coordinator Research Ethics. So I'm also responsible for the Animal Ethics Committee, but also for the Biosafety Committee, or the Reg Best as we refer to it. It went, we had a name change a few years back, I think 2 years back. Initially, the committee was the Research Ethics Committee, Biosafety and Environmental Ethics, and the acronym was REC-BEE. And from time to time, believe it or not, HR would call and ask information on the REC-BEE committee because they thought it was Black Economic Empowerment Committee, and we are certainly not that. Okay, with that said, I decided to develop a slide just showing where exactly this committee fits into the whole scheme of research ethics at the institution. So this committee reports to the Senate Research Ethics Committee, who is the policy-making committee. And that committee is managed by Dr. Nicola Barsdorf, who is also the Director for Research Integrity and Ethics at the institution. And under that ethics committee, or Senate Research Ethics Committee, there are 4 review committees, but actually 5, because there are 2 health research ethics committees. And as you can see, the Biosafety Committee there, I highlighted it in green, also reports to the Senate Research Ethics Committee. So these are the review committees within the research ethics ambit of the university. that would accept applications, review them, and provide feedback to applicants. And I've also listed the various people responsible for these committees. So the university then had to establish the Biosafety Committee as part of or under the Policy for Responsible Research Conduct. And that committee was officially established, or a memorandum was sent out, a campus-wide memorandum, to state that the committee is now ready to accept applications. That was done in 16 March 2016. It took some time to get the committee up and running in terms of developing SOPs, making sure that there are application forms that make sense, unpacking biosafety, the biosafety program at the institutions in terms of how we would tackle this phenomena, in terms of separating facilities and separating the actual application for work on a particular organism. So under this policy, the committee then developed an SOP, unpacking what its scope would be. And as Professor Sampson alluded to this already, the committee is focused on the use of biohazardous materials on biosafety level 2 and up to biosafety level 3. We don't have biosafety level 4 type work. GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and then of course engineered nano materials. So the scope then for this committee entails that it need to ensure that all research, teaching, and testing activities under the auspices of the university are submitted for review by this committee if your work involves biohazardous organisms, GMOs, and nanomaterial. As Sam has also indicated, this is to comply with international and national guidelines on biological and environmental safety, and typically referring to the World Health Organization, the NIH, the CDC, but also I think our NHLS. And the other aspect is to prevent and reduce exposure, as Sam has indicated, for the laboratory workers, other persons, and then of course the environment. What is very important here is to note that the committee scope ends there. So we do not consider applications when for the safe handling of chemical hazards or chemically hazardous material and radiation. That is dealt with within the occupational health and safety program of the university, whether that be at faculty level, department level, or at the central office for occupational health and safety, which is, I believe, managed by Mr. Manifil Yoon. So the RegBes will not review applications if you're working with hazardous chemicals or if your work involves radiation. There are experts that already have this covered. So this is just the slide indicating the various organisms that the committee would consider. So it's viruses, bacteria, fungi, and then also GMOs, but also nano or engineered nano objects or engineered nanomaterial. So this is just a slide that I put together indicating or showing who the members are. We have Professor Sampson there, top left, and then Karina is next to her, who is the vice chair for this committee. And I've added the various environments that they come from. So we have quite a wide array of experts serving on this committee. We have, for example, Dr. Henny Groenewald, who's the chair for Biosafety South Africa and an expert in GMO work, as well as other committee members from the various environments. This committee is then supported by Dr. Nicola Barsdorf, who's the head for this, the Integrity and Ethics function at the institution, and myself, Winston and Aidan, who is then the administrative support for the committee. I didn't put my picture there because I believe you can see me. Okay, so an important aspect to consider is the application procedure for the committee. So, and this was unpacked at the very first meeting of the committee, actually. This was, I think, in 2012 or 2011, where we considered what a biosafety program should look like, what should it entail, and we realized that as a first step, we need to find out what laboratories we have on campus and what is in those laboratories. And we started a campaign to have all laboratories registered with a committee that work with microorganisms that would require containment level 2 and higher. And once you've registered your facility, we can now we issue you with a certificate stating that you are working, that in this facility you have the following organisms, microorganisms. E. coli, you have TB, you have all of them listed in that facility registration. Your project application would now say, okay, here is my facility registration as part of my project application, but I am only going to work with the tuberculosis as listed in the facility registration, and I'm going to manipulate it like this. I'm going to have these barriers. I'm going to have the following PPE, and these are the people that will form part of the project. So this is a two-phase approach in terms of we can never approve an application if the work is not conducted in a registered facility. So the process is similar, but the content in terms of floor plans relates to the facility registration, whereas your risk assessments, your SOPs, and those sorts of things will be very specific to the project application. And as always, you are more than welcome to contact us. You contact me or you contact the Ethics Help Desk if you need assistance with getting more information on these two separate yet important steps that the committee requires for an application. I alluded to it now. We also are fortunate to have an ethics help desk that would be able to assist you with queries related to statuses of applications, where in the process they are, and also support you with the online application system. As we have an online application system that you can access anywhere in the world, you can start an application, not finish it, come back to it, complete it, send it to various persons that need to provide input into the application, and finally you can submit it via that system. The Ethics Help Desk email is applyethics@sun.ac.za. Please feel free to make use of the service contact. The person responsible for the Ethics Help Desk is Mr. Aidan Williams. He is also the gentleman listed on the group photo. Very competent and able to assist you with your query. And as I referred to the system, it is called Infonetica, and that's our ethics application system, and that's the same system for all the ethics review committees. I've put the URL there for you, and as I said, you can access your application anytime, anywhere in the world, as long as you have a good internet connection. Very important are the meeting dates. So from this year, the committee will have more frequent meetings. As opposed to last year, we only met once a quarter, and that resulted in large volumes of applications being reviewed at a meeting. And we realized that there is a need for more frequent intervals in terms of meetings for the committee. So the next committee meeting was scheduled for 17 February, but unfortunately 2022 was quite a shocker to the system. So we had to reschedule, and our ethics, the biosafety meeting is after this session at 2. And there you can see the rest of the meeting dates, and these dates are all listed on the Division for Research Development's website that you can access for information pertaining to this committee, whether that be meeting dates, committee members, or additional information related to the biosafety program at the institution. We also developed a video talking about biosafety or biosafety ethics at the institution. Unfortunately, I'm not going to play it to you now because lots of logistics when playing a video in Teams, but you are more than welcome to go onto our website and watch the video, or alternatively, you can take down this link and you can watch the video. It's very interesting, and we try to explain biosafety in a short period, a short time, yet with enough information to get you to understand why the committee is there. And lastly, I just end with this slide that says integrity, the choice between what's convenient and what's right. And with biosafety, sometimes we find the convenient way of doing things is not necessarily the right way, and the convenient way could also open yourself up for lots of risk, open up your fellow lab workers to risk, and we would want you to rather do what is right in terms of biosafety. There's my email address. You are more than welcome to send me an email. Alternatively, you can also send Mr. Aidan Williams an email at Apply Ethics, so with the help desk, and we will try to get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you. I think we can now open up for questions. So I see we have a question already. JP Hutton, is it Professor Hutton?
Winston, there's actually an earlier question from Dr. Ramaboli.
Okay, so let's just see. Thank you for your presentation, Sam. My question, who should take the basic biosafety training and how frequent should the training be done? Okay, over to you, Sam.
Okay, so thank you for this question. I just want to say what I didn't say in my presentation is that we provided this as an option for people. So if people have really well documented biosafety training, they are welcome to provide evidence for that. We would prefer that there is something structured that people can provide evidence for, and that's the reason why we've provided this material. So there are other options that companies provide, but those cost, and this is free. So in short, the response would be that anybody who is on an application to RecBase, who is a named investigator on that, should do the training. Winston, I don't think we have a definite answer to how frequently. In our division, I can tell you the expectation is that we want people to do this every year. So our division previously we would do an annual biosafety presentation, but we are going to now use these materials as a replacement for that. So we want people to be doing it every year. But I think that is a choice of ours, and I think that you have to figure out in your own environment. Does that answer your question? You're welcome to go on microphone.
Yes, question has been answered. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, colleague. Thank you, Sam. The next question is from Professor Harting. Very difficult question, though, but I'll try my best to answer it. Sam, you are more than welcome to jump in. So I'll start with the latter part of his question, the overlap between the RecBase and the RecACU. So obviously there will be in certain cases where you work with transgenic animals, for instance, that would require animal ethics approval, but also the RecBase. These processes can, when they overlap, they can run concurrently. You submit the two applications at the same time. Because I am so uniquely positioned between the two committees, I can have one eye on the ACU application and one eye on the RecBase application. And if there's an application that falls on the table of the ACU but has not yet registered on the RecBase, I could inform the applicant that there's a need for RecBase as well. So I think that is a good, I don't think we initially, when we set it up like this, that I would be the coordinator for the two committees, thought of that, but it works out well, that there is a central person that can have an eye on those. Samantha, would you want to answer that first part of the question?
So Winston, I'm going to come back. I'll come back to the first part, but I also just wanted to jump in on what you've addressed now. And I think I tried to allude to this in my talk as well. We are striving to have better communication between the different committees. There are some people who are in an unfortunate position, and I'm involved in some projects like this where we require HREC, rec-based and rec-ACU, because we would be getting samples from human patients and putting them into mice. And so we do need to get approvals from all of these committees. Yes. But having said that, I think we have pretty good communication with HREC, with Blanche, the chairs of the two HREC committees. So critically, speak to the people who are representing those committees before you start, because they can suggest, this is something that it requires all three committees, but, this is maybe the more efficient way of doing it. In terms of, I might need a little bit of clarification. Sorry, I'm not sure what your name is. I just see the surname Hatton. But in terms of when you're talking about lab research, research outside of laboratories, I can think of one example, but maybe you can say what you're thinking of, and then I'll talk about mine.
Yes, perhaps you can, speak to us, Prof. Hatton.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm just thinking about possible research in terms of GMOs, for instance, in the field from some of our colleagues in agriculture. You've referred to transgenic animals, alien invasive species, a few of kinds of research that are not laboratory based, but are actually research projects that go outside of the laboratory with environmental impacts. That's what I had in mind.
Thank you, Johan. So our committee do have experts in GMOs, obviously Biosafety South Africa, but work related to, so in the beginning when the committee was formed, it had an environmental ethics component, which I still think should be there, but we do not, as a routine, review applications where projects involve you going out to plant GMO trees or something. Sam, I'm not too sure.
So, I mean, it's hard to comment without more specifics on the project. So this again would be something that we'd review on a case-by-case basis. The example I'm thinking of, I'm not sure if this will help, Winston, is the recent projects we've reviewed looking at wastewater monitoring. So in that case, this is projects where people go and collect wastewater, and obviously this has come about because of COVID, and they're monitoring the SARS-CoV-2 in that. So in that instance, those are risky samples, and it is something that requires review by our committee. So it really is on a case-by-case basis, and critically, this is where the risk assessment comes in. And so we would be happy to work with people on an individual basis on that. And in terms of the GMOs, I think we'd definitely get input from Henny on that.
Yeah, we also had scheduled a session last year or the year before that focused specifically on the use of GMOs within the institution and how to go about applying for the permits. And Henny was very instrumental in that talk. Johan, I hope that answered your question. If not, we are happy to talk after this.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, indeed, I know it is a very technical area, but it can also be a very wide area. And I'm just curious as to how the mandate was defined. If it's on a risk basis, then I think it's fine. But then, of course, still how narrowly or how wide the risks are interpreted that are important. But that's part of the game that we have to be alert in how we define our terms.
So, thank you. Go on.
So Winston, sorry, before we take the next question, I just wanted to make one comment there. And, clearly we're not experts in everything, but one of the things we do, and I think neither of us mentioned this, is that if a particular project such as, something you're describing here comes across our desks, we would enlist ad hoc reviewers in that area. And, we can get people from outside of Stellenbosch as well. So we wouldn't just be making decisions based on our uninformed background. So just to reassure people on that. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you, Johan. You are also welcome to join the Biosafety Committee with your expertise. So the next question comes from Natasha. How can we access the training on Sunland? So the procedure is that you inform Mr. Aidan Williams that you would want to get access to the training material, and then he will add you on SunLearn, you need to provide him with your name and surname and SU number. Unfortunately, there is some hiccup on SunLearn, and we are unable to load people since Tuesday, I think. Aiden wasn't able to load people, but we are in discussions with SunLearn. So we should be able to add people or enroll persons by early next week.
Maybe I can just jump in there, because obviously this is, I know, Natasha, so your group is currently in BMRI as well, and I'm not sure if you have a GLP rep as well, but in our division, because we're so huge, and that's probably what broke SunLearn, is we've gathered names, one person has gathered names and given them to Aiden. So you might want to funnel that through your GLP rep or one specific person to make it easier.
Yes. Okay. Any other questions, colleagues, before we say bye? If not, Samantha, thank you again for talking to us about biosafety at the institution. And we hope to receive lots of applications after this talk. And you are more than welcome to contact this office to ask for advice with regard to your applications, and we will assist where we can. With that said, thank you, colleagues, and enjoy the rest of your lunch hour.